Joining us now to discuss BTC price and more is Nick Mancini, research analyst at Sentiment Tracker, Trade the Chain. Hello there, Nick. So, sentiment that you're tracking today, what might explain Bitcoin's short-term price movements?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I think some of the sentiment data that we're seeing explains the topsy-turviness that we're seeing in the market. So interestingly enough, you can look at sentiment from two perspectives, from a single day intraday perspective to a multi-day, multi-week perspective. And from an hourly perspective, Bitcoin actually was very correlated with sentiment early on. We had a drop overnight where we saw some prices dip as well. We had an increase heading to the morning. We actually flipped into bullish right when we had that weird spike just before the CPI news dropped. And then we became bearish again. And then right before the pop, we had, again, positive sentiment. So it's been very topsy-turvy and inline. But I think the more interesting factor is the weekly and the daily sentiment. Now, what we've seen is a much more bullish sentiment in the past week than we have seen in the past 8 weeks. So, I mean, we have a more or less night and day difference in terms of trader outlook compared to just a few weeks ago. We're at about 4 to 5 days of bullish sentiment out of 7, whereas we were 1 to 2 at best in that large bear downturn. So overall, traders are becoming a little bit more euphoric now that we've seemed to find a macro bottom. But at an hourly level, it is still very closely correlated with general price action. It makes it a very good kind of swing trade metric, if you will.
I want to zero in on that inflation reaction because, a lot of the narrative argues that Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation, and lo and behold, we see a 40-year high. Inflation, beyond expectations, 7.5% annual increase, and yet Bitcoin was pretty flat afterwards.
Yes, and overall, if you're looking at the daily perspective, yes, you're 100% correct. So if you are a very passive trader or a holder, today looks like nothing other than a very average day after 7 to 8 days of bullish price action. But if you actually look a little bit closer, we can see the specific kind of hour by hour or even the 15-minute charts to see exactly what happened. So Bitcoin actually got a bit of a boost. I think risk assets were expecting a worse than expected CPI print, which has been kind of good for risk assets lately. A kind of a hotter than average economy has been good for risk, but it was egregiously high, the highest in 40 years, like you said, and that scared investors. And I think any kind of black swan or very tumultuous market event causes an immediate sell-off. But I always say, and I always tell our global community of traders, generally on days like this, the first trade is typically wrong. You saw a steep drop in Bitcoin almost immediately recover on the next hourly or following hourly candles. Now we're obviously hovering in that range that we created today, but the CPI print clearly created some volatility. But the fact that we're not dropping, the fact that we're not continually dropping or lower than where we were trading at yesterday, the fact that we're not lower, I should say, is cause for optimism. Because if CPI is high and you expect the Fed to make such drastic measures and Bitcoin is still hovering around the same range as where it opened today, after that news, that is a bit of a kind of eyebrow raiser in terms of future bullish price action. Yeah,
and it could be argued that it was already priced in ahead of time and that now folks are concerned that maybe there will be more hawkish Feds around the world, central banks around the world, and anticipating that. What kind of headwinds are you tracking for Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think probably the largest looming headwind that I don't see as a negative, but I do see as a hindrance to positive price action is regulation. So I think eventually the Fed and the SEC and Congress will collaborate together on stablecoin guidance, on general crypto guidance in general, specifically DeFi and NFTs, kind of digging into that realm a little bit more because that's where the most risk really is currently. So I think any furtherance of regulation is going to create some uncertainty in the markets, and uncertainty does not bode well for positive price action. So that's probably the biggest headwind. But then the other one I think is this multinational kind of posturing that we're seeing between Russia, China, the US, El Salvador, other emerging nations, all kind of figuring out whether or not they want to add Bitcoin to the balance sheet or assessing it as an asset that they want to engage with or have their population engage with even even 2. So we just saw India with 30% tax. Russia seems to be embracing it. China is not. The U.S. is still in limbo. So I see this. I see multinational strife as a potential headwind, but that could also be a tailwind. If the right country adopts Bitcoin or passes the right law, that could also be a big boost in the future as well.
Yeah, in terms of tailwinds, a lot of institutional investment steadily building up. Even sovereign wealth funds, I'm hearing more and more about that, at least discussions being had, which is very interesting. So I'm wondering, what's your short to long-term outlook for Bitcoin?
Oof, that's a tough one considering the volatility we're seeing now. Today, just based on what we saw and the fact that RSI is not completely overbought yet, I would say that, in the medium term, I would be shocked if we did not at least try to move into the 50K range and continually inch up to 49K. But we do know that Bitcoin is extremely volatile. We know that sentiment is in a position that can be changed with the right kind of headline. So even though we do seem to be on a sort of a bullish warpath, given the recent Fed news and the fact that we should expect a Fed decision potentially in the next 4 to 6 weeks, I would expect some volatility as the market attempts to price in what it thinks is going to come over the next month or so. So mid to short term, expect volatility. I would not go all in, but I am continually inching into the market every dip or every kind of leg up that we make. And you mentioned the 50-day moving average on the daily chart. That's a very key metric. And if we can stay above 43K, I would be very bullish going into the future as long as we can steadily hold that level over the next week or so.